Hello there, Uncharted Historian here, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we travel back to a world that feels both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. A world teeming with life, where cities are growing faster than anyone can manage, and the air is thick with the sounds and smells of humanity pressed close together. Imagine standing on a street corner in a great European city. The sky above is a thin sliver, almost completely blocked by the upper stories of timber-framed houses leaning precariously towards each other. The year is 1346, and well, you probably won't survive the next 5 years. Statistically speaking, of course. So, before we drift too far back in time, if you find a quiet sort of value in these explorations of the past, a simple like or subscribe lets me know we're on the right track. As always with our videos, the visuals aren't necessary to enjoy the story and are just here to provide extra context. I'm always fascinated to see where in the world these stories find you, so feel free to leave your city and local time in the comments below. Now, find that comfortable spot, let the world outside fade away, and allow the gentle hum of the past to draw you in. Let's begin our journey. You are standing in the heart of a world that believes it is old, that its ways are set and eternal, watched over by a God whose rules are strict but ultimately understandable. The air you breathe is a complex tapestry of scents. There's the comforting aroma of baking bread from a communal oven down the lane, the sharp tang of wood smoke, the earthy smell of livestock being led through the streets, and underneath it all, the ever-present, pungent odor of human waste. The local river is your water source, your washing machine, and your sewer. A real multitasker. This is the normal, everyday sensory landscape of the mid-14th century. Your world is loud, so incredibly loud. Not with the engine roar of our time, but with the clatter and clang of life lived in the open. A blacksmith's hammer rings out a steady, rhythmic beat. The wooden wheels of a cart groan and rattle over uneven cobblestones. Merchants shout their wares from market stalls, their voices weaving together in a dozen different dialects. Church bells toll the hours, a constant reminder of the divine order that structures your day, your week, your entire life. You are never truly alone, and you are never in silence. Just walking from your small shared room to the local tavern involves brushing past 100 people, a practice that felt perfectly normal then, but would probably send a modern person into a panic. Life is governed by the seasons and the church. For most people, the world is small. It's your village, the next village over, and maybe, if you're a merchant or a pilgrim, a city you've heard of in stories. Your identity is tied to your family, your guild, your parish. You know your place. This isn't to say life is simple, but there is a certainty to it. The king is in his castle, the pope is in Avignon, and God is in his heaven. Everything makes a certain kind of sense, as long as you don't ask too many inconvenient questions, like why the harvest failed for the third year in a row. And that is a question on many people's minds. Unbeknownst to you and everyone you know, the climate itself is changing. The centuries-long medieval warm period, a time of relative plenty and population growth, has been sputtering to a close. Now, you are in the first decades of what future historians will call the Little Ice Age. The winters are becoming longer and harsher, the summers cooler and wetter. This has had a devastating effect on agriculture. A crucial fact of your existence is the Great Famine that swept across northern Europe from 1315 to 1317, just a generation before you were born. Your parents and grandparents told you stories of endless rain, rotted crops, and a hunger so profound it etched itself into the collective memory of the people. Millions perished. The population, which had been booming for centuries, was checked for the first time in a long while. Historians still argue whether the lingering effects of these famines directly compromise the immune systems of the European population on a massive scale, creating a perfectly vulnerable host for the disease that was to come. Or was the pestilence so virulent, so completely alien to human biology at the time, that it would have been just as devastating to a well-fed and healthy populace? It's a somber calculation, weighing one catastrophe against another. What is certain is that the continent you stand on is not a bastion of strength. It is a continent of crowded, unsanitary cities, of a people whose bodies may have been weakened by malnutrition, and whose minds are steeped in a faith that will soon be tested beyond all imagination. You see this fragility everywhere, if you know where to look. You walk through a city like Paris, a true medieval metropolis, and you can't help but notice the sheer density of it all. The streets are a tangled web, some so narrow you can touch both walls with outstretched arms. The upper floors of buildings jut out over the street below, creating a permanent twilight in the alleyways. It's a wonderfully quirky, organic way to build a city, but it also means that sunlight and fresh air are luxuries reserved for the wealthy who have open courtyards. For everyone else, life is lived in the shadows. This architectural style, while charming in a historical sense, is an accidental invitation for contagion. It creates a closed, dim, and damp environment where things can spread with terrifying efficiency. The rats, of course, love it. They are your constant, unseen neighbors, thriving in the refuse and the darkness. For now, they are just a part of the background noise of life, a minor nuisance. Soon, they, or rather the passengers they carry, will become the arbiters of fate for an entire continent. But you don't know that. Nobody does. All you know is the feel of the damp air, the sound of the evening bells calling people to prayer, and the comforting, if slightly claustrophobic, press of the crowd. It is the world as it has always been. A world on the very edge of a cliff, about to take one final, unknowing step. Your world, the one of crowded cities and looming church spires, feels ancient and all-encompassing. But now, let's pull back, further and further, until the entire continent of Europe is just a peninsula on a vast landmass. Our journey doesn't begin in your world at all. It begins thousands of miles to the east, in the seemingly empty grasslands of the Central Asian steppe. The air here isn't thick with the smell of humanity. It's thin, sharp, and carries the scent of dust and dry grass on a wind that never seems to stop blowing. This is where our story truly starts, not with a bang, but with a microscopic opportunist making a fateful leap. Imagine you are watching a small community of rodents, not the black rats of European cities, but something different. Perhaps Tarbagan marmots, chunky little burrowers who have lived in this region for millennia. For centuries, they have carried a secret within their blood, a bacterium named Yersinia pestis. In their isolated colonies, it flares up, thins out the population, and then recedes. A natural, brutal cycle. It is a local problem for the marmots and a minor occupational hazard for the hunters who seek their pelts. For all of human history, this deadly equilibrium has held. The bacterium has been contained by geography, trapped in its remote homeland. But the world is changing. The change came thundering across the plains a century earlier. The Mongol Empire, in its explosive expansion, had fundamentally rewired the world. They created the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Eastern Europe. While their methods of expansion were, to put it mildly, not known for their gentleness, the result was a period of unprecedented stability and communication across Asia. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Suddenly, long-distance travel was not only possible, but relatively safe. A single authority controlled the whole route, and they were very, very interested in trade. For the first time, a merchant could travel from China to the Crimea with a reasonable expectation of arriving with both his goods and his head intact. This vast, unified territory became a superhighway for silk, spices, ideas, and for our silent passenger. Historians still pore over ancient evidence, from climate data to DNA fragments, trying to pinpoint the exact moment the fuse was lit. Some evidence points to the area around Lake Issyk-Kul, in what is now Kyrgyzstan. There, archaeologists found a cluster of graves from the 1330s, with inscriptions mentioning an unknown pestilence. Is this it? Is this our patient zero? The first spark that will ignite the world? Or did it begin elsewhere, perhaps in Western China, as other accounts suggest? The debate continues, a quiet academic puzzle about the origins of a global catastrophe. What is clear is that sometime in the early 14th century, something shifted. A climate event, a change in trade patterns, or just simple bad luck caused the plague to break out of its rodent reservoir and jump into a new, far more mobile host, the black rat. Now, you see it moving. Not as a visible wave, but as a slow, creeping infiltration. It joins a caravan in Samarkand, a legendary city of soaring turquoise domes. The merchants are excited, their wagons laden with goods that will fetch a fortune in the West. They have no idea that their most valuable commodity, in terms of sheer impact, is a disease hiding in their supplies. The journey is agonizingly slow by our standards. There's no next-day delivery on the Silk Road. It's a trek of months, even years, through brutal deserts and high mountain passes. Along the way, the caravan stops at oasis towns and caravanserai, medieval rest stops for weary travelers. At each stop, a few rats might disembark, finding a new home. A few infected fleas might find a new host. A local trader, a child, a town guard. They feel a sudden fever, a painful swelling in their groin or armpit. Their family tends to them, confused. Then they too fall ill, and the black rat, Rattus rattus, was the perfect vessel. Unlike the homebody marmots, these rats loved to travel. They were climbers, explorers, and experts at infesting human settlements and, crucially, human transportation. They stowed away in grain sacks, in bolts of silk, in the dusty corners of wagons pulled by camels and oxen. And on the rats, unseen and unfelt, were fleas. These fleas, carrying the bacterium, were the bridge. A flea bites an infected rat, drinks its blood, and the bacteria multiply in the flea's gut, forming a blockage. The flea becomes desperately hungry. It jumps to a new host, another rat, or perhaps a human camel driver, and bites. As it tries to feed, it regurgitates the bacteria-laden blood into the new wound. The jump has been made. The original caravan moves on, oblivious, leaving behind a tiny, smoldering ember of infection that will soon burst into flame. This is how it travels, a chain reaction in slow motion. From Central Asia, it splinters, following the main arteries of trade. One branch pushes south towards India and China. Another moves west. It reaches the great cities of the Middle East, Baghdad, Damascus, reigniting old fears, as this part of the world had encountered the plague centuries before in the reign of Justinian. But for Europe, this is a new terror. It is creeping towards them, carried by the very trade that is making their continent rich and connected. Each transaction, each exotic good brought to a new market, carries with it an invisible risk. People in Italy are buying silks that have passed through a dozen hands, completely unaware of the microscopic stowaways that came along for the ride. It's the ultimate irony of globalization. The connections that bring prosperity can also bring peril. The world has become smaller, more connected than ever before, and it is this very interconnectedness that will seal its fate. As you watch the pestilence make its final overland push towards the Black Sea, you realize the world of 1346 isn't on the brink of a random disaster. It is on the brink of a disaster it has, in its ambition and its success, helped to create. The journey across the vast, dry heart of Asia is over. Our silent traveler has now arrived at the edge of your world, the threshold between the Mongol East and the European West. You find yourself on the Crimean Peninsula, a teardrop of land dangling in the Black Sea. The air here is different. You can taste the salt carried on the breeze. This peninsula is a crossroads, a place where cultures and economies collide, and your focus narrows to a single city, a place of immense strategic and commercial importance. Caffa, modern-day Feodosia, is a prize. It's a bustling, fortified trading post operated by merchants from Genoa, one of Italy's maritime superpowers. For them, Caffa is the golden ticket, the final terminus of the Silk Road. It's where silks, spices, and other Eastern luxuries are offloaded from camel caravans and loaded onto sailing ships for the profitable journey to Europe. The city is a vibrant, chaotic mix of Italian sailors, Greek artisans, Armenian merchants, and local Tatars. It's a place built for profit, protected by thick stone walls that rise defiantly against the surrounding grasslands. And those walls are about to be put to the test. For the past year, Caffa has been under siege. The city is surrounded by a vast army of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that rules this territory. Their leader, Johnny Beg, is not pleased with these arrogant Italian merchants. Disputes over trade, taxes, and a few brawls that escalated into something much worse have led to this standoff. You stand on the battlements with the Genoese defenders, looking out at the endless sea of Mongol tents. The siege is a miserable affair. Days are filled with the thud of catapult stones against the walls and the whistle of arrows. Nights are tense and watchful. Food and water are rationed. But the Genoese are sailors and traders. They are stubborn and resilient. They believe they can wait this out. Their ships can still bring supplies by sea, and Mongol armies, they reason, can't stay in one place forever. But then, something changes in the besieging army. The relentless attacks begin to falter. From your vantage point on the wall, you notice a strange lack of activity in the Mongol camp. The usual shouts and movements are replaced by an eerie quiet. Rumors begin to trickle in from spies and deserters, whispers of a devastating illness sweeping through the Mongol ranks. They speak of high fevers, painful swellings, and a swift, almost certain departure from this world. The Genoese defenders on the walls of Caffa probably felt a surge of grim satisfaction. It seems God, or at least a powerful disease, is on their side. Their enemy is being vanquished for them. The siege will surely soon be over. But Johnny Beg, watching his army dissolve around him, is not a man to accept defeat gracefully. He decides on one final, desperate act of vengeance. A mainstream historical account, perhaps the most famous story from this entire period, describes what happens next. It comes from a man named Gabriele de Mussi, a lawyer from Piacenza, Italy, who wrote about it a year or so later. He describes Johnny Beg ordering his men to load the afflicted bodies of their fallen comrades onto the catapults. The massive siege engines, which had been hurling rocks, are re-aimed. With a great groan of twisted ropes, they launch a new, horrific type of ammunition. The bodies of the plague victims are flung high into the air, tumbling end over end, before sailing over the city walls and landing with a sickening thud in the streets of Caffa. Imagine the sheer psychological terror of that moment. It's one thing to be attacked with stones and arrows, but to have the heavens rain down the diseased remains of your enemies is a horror of a different magnitude. The Genoese defenders, shocked and disgusted, scrambled to get rid of the bodies, hauling them away and casting them into the sea. But it is too late. The damage is done. The act, according to de Mussi, was devastatingly effective. It was as if they were shooting arrows of suffering, he wrote, and soon the poisonous disease was spreading within the besieged city. Now, historians, ever the party poopers, have a lively debate about this. Did this event, this act of medieval biological warfare, really happen exactly as de Mussi described it? Some scholars argue that his account is overly dramatic, perhaps a metaphor for the horror rather than a literal report. They suggest that the plague more likely entered Caffa the old-fashioned way, via infected rats scurrying through the siege lines and into the city's granaries. It's a less spectacular image, but perhaps a more plausible one. The rats, after all, would not respect a siege line. The debate hinges on whether throwing bodies was the primary vector of transmission, or just a terrifying sideshow to an infiltration that was already underway. Regardless of the precise method of entry, be it a fiendish catapult or a common rat, the result was the same. The pestilence was inside Caffa. The mysterious illness that had crippled the Mongol army was now stalking the narrow streets of the trading post. The Genoese, who had moments before celebrated their salvation, found themselves trapped in a city that was rapidly becoming a tomb. The air inside the walls, once filled with the smell of spices and the sea, was now thick with fear and the scent of sickness. The defenders began to fall, not to Mongol arrows, but to the invisible enemy within. The siege was effectively over, but the war had just begun, and the Genoese had lost in a way they could never have imagined. Their only hope was escape. A handful of Genoese galleys floating in the harbor now seemed like the only way out. As the sick and the dying crowded the docks, desperate to flee, a few ships managed to cast off their lines and sail out of the harbor, leaving the doomed city behind. They were heading west, back home to Italy. They were running for their lives, but they were not running alone. They were carrying the plague with them. The salty spray of the Black Sea mists your face as you stand on the deck of one of the Genoese galleys fleeing Caffa. The city, with its grim new secret, shrinks behind you, becoming just another smudge on the horizon. A sense of relief washes over the ship, but it's thin and brittle, easily broken. The journey ahead is long, a voyage that will take you through the Bosphorus Strait, past the magnificent but wary city of Constantinople, through the Aegean archipelago with its sun-bleached islands, and into the heart of the Mediterranean. It is a well-worn trade route, a liquid highway connecting east and west. But this is no ordinary voyage. This is a floating vessel of contagion, a wooden horse carrying a microscopic army. On board, the atmosphere is tense. Every cough, every feverish flush on a sailor's cheek sends a ripple of fear through the crew. Men who survived the siege of Caffa now eye each other with suspicion. The cramped quarters of the ship, which normally foster a rough camaraderie, now feel like a trap. The rats that scurry in the hold, long considered a simple annoyance and a minor threat to the ship's biscuits, are now the unknowing ferrymen of this new dread. One of the quirky, and in this case tragic tidbits of medieval seafaring is the sheer number of rats that were considered a normal part of any ship's ecosystem. They were a given, a constant presence that no one thought twice about, much like barnacles on the hull. The ships, perhaps a dozen of them, do not all sail together. They scatter, each heading for a different port, a different home. Some limp into Constantinople, where the plague gets its first real foothold in a major European city, devastating the Byzantine capital. Others push on, their crews dwindling with each passing week. Men who were hale and hearty when they left the Crimea are now laid low by the mysterious illness. Their bodies are unceremoniously wrapped in sailcloth and given to the sea, a desperate attempt to purge the vessel of its affliction. But it's like trying to bail out the ocean with a cup. The disease is already loose. Our focus, however, settles on one particular flotilla of ships, the ones that hold true to their course for Italy. After weeks at sea, they finally sight the familiar coastline of Sicily. Their destination is Messina, a bustling port city on the island's northeastern tip. It is October 1347. From the shore, you watch the ships approach. They are a welcome sight, a sign of commerce and connection to the wider world. The harbor is, as always, a hive of activity. Merchants, dock workers, and city officials gather at the piers, ready to greet the ships, assess their cargo, and collect their taxes. But as the galleys draw closer, a sense of unease begins to spread through the waiting crowd. Something is wrong. The sails are ragged. The ships ride strangely high in the water, as if their holds are not full of the expected silks and spices. There is an unnatural quiet about them. No sailors line the rails, shouting greetings to those on shore. They glide into the harbor like ghost ships. When the hawsers are thrown and the gangplanks lowered, the true horror is revealed. A chronicler of the time, Michael of Piazza, described the scene. He tells us that the Genoese ships entered the harbor with sickness clinging to their very bones. The few sailors who were still able to stand were pale, spectral figures, stumbling with fever and weakness. Many more were already gone, their bodies left in the Aegean, and a great many more were still below deck, in the final, agonizing stages of the illness. They were covered in dark swellings, which he described as being the size of an egg or an apple in the groin and armpits. These boils, he wrote, oozed and spread, and were a sure sign that the afflicted had only days, if not hours, to live. The people of Messina, who had gathered to welcome the ships, recoiled in terror. The city officials acted with what they thought was swiftness. They immediately placed the ships and their crews under a strict quarantine. No one was allowed to disembark, and no one from the city was allowed to board. The term quarantine itself would be invented in the coming years, in Venice, derived from the Italian word for 40, quaranta. For the 40 days ships would be forced to wait offshore. But here in Messina, the concept was still new, an ad hoc reaction to an unprecedented crisis. They hoped to isolate the disease, to keep it contained on the water. The death-bearing ships, as they came to be called, were eventually driven out of the harbor. The furious and terrified citizens of Messina forced them back to sea, to drift aimlessly and carry their curse elsewhere. But they were casting out the symbol, not the cause. The seeds of the pestilence were already sown in their city. Within days, the first residents of Messina, people who had never set foot on a Genoese galley, began to fall ill with the same terrifying symptoms. The panic was absolute. People fled the city in droves, streaming into the Sicilian countryside, hoping to outrun the invisible enemy. But many of them were already carrying it with them. They were not escaping the plague. They were spreading it. From this single point of entry, this tragic arrival in a Sicilian port, the pestilence would now explode across Europe with a speed and ferocity that no one could have possibly imagined. The black sails had brought the storm ashore. The pestilence is no longer a distant rumor from the east or a horror confined to a ship. It is here, walking the streets of Europe with you. It has slipped the bonds of Messina and is now spreading like a dark stain across the map, moving with the speed of a horse-drawn cart or a coastal vessel. As it establishes itself, people begin to recognize its patterns, its different ways of manifesting. You quickly learn that this is not one single uniform affliction. It has, as the physicians and chroniclers of the time desperately tried to classify, three distinct and terrible faces. Understanding these three forms is to understand the multifaceted nature of the terror that gripped the continent. The first and most common form is the one you heard about from Messina. This is the bubonic plague. You are walking through your town, trying to go about your daily business, but a new, dreadful awareness follows you everywhere. You watch your friends, your family, your neighbors for the first signs. It starts innocently enough. A sudden fever, chills, a headache, and a general feeling of profound weakness, like a draining of your very life force. You might try to dismiss it as a simple fever, a common ailment. But then comes the telltale sign, the thing that dashes all hope. A swelling appears, a painful, hard lump in the lymph nodes of the groin, the armpit, or the neck. This is the bubo, from which the plague gets its name. The bubo begins as a small, tender knot under the skin and can swell to the size of an apple. It is an outpost of the infection, a lymph node overwhelmed by the Yersinia pestis bacteria. The skin over it becomes stretched and discolored, often turning a dark, bruised purple or black, which gave the whole pandemic its most famous and evocative name, the Black Death. This is a mainstream historical fact, though the term Black Death was not actually the most common name used at the time. Contemporaries were more likely to call it the Great Pestilence, the Great Mortality, or simply the Affliction. The term Black Death only became widespread centuries later, but it perfectly captures the visual horror of the buboes. These dark swellings became the defining symbol of the plague, a physical manifestation of the poison within. Once the buboes appeared, the course of the illness was swift and brutal. The fever would spike, delirium would set in, and the body would be racked with pain. Without modern medical intervention, this form of the plague was incredibly dangerous, with a very high rate of fatality. But sometimes, the illness takes a different, even more terrifying path. The second face of the pestilence is the pneumonic plague. In this version, the infection lodges itself directly in the lungs. It can be a primary infection, or it can develop as a complication of the bubonic form. Instead of buboes, the symptoms are respiratory. A hacking cough begins, and soon the patient is bringing up a bloody, frothy sputum. The great horror of the pneumonic form was its method of transmission. Unlike the bubonic plague, which required the bite of an infected flea, the pneumonic plague could be transmitted directly from person to person. A single cough could spray infectious droplets into the air, which could then be inhaled by anyone nearby. This changes everything. Suddenly, the flea and the rat are no longer necessary intermediaries. The disease can leap directly through the air, making it vastly more contagious. In the crowded, poorly ventilated homes of the 14th century, one person with pneumonic plague could infect their entire family in a single night. This form was also far more lethal than the bubonic version. Once the coughing of blood began, the end was almost certain, often coming within a day or two. There was no time for buboes to form. The lungs were simply destroyed from within. Historians still debate what percentage of cases were pneumonic versus bubonic. Some argue the pneumonic form was a rare but terrifying mutation, while others believe it was a significant driver of the plague's incredibly rapid spread, especially during the colder winter months when people were huddled together indoors. Then there is the third and most mysterious face, the septicemic plague. This form is the swiftest and most deadly of all. In these cases, the Yersinia pestis bacteria enters the bloodstream directly and multiplies at an astonishing rate. There is no time for buboes to form, no time for a cough to develop. A person could feel perfectly healthy in the morning and be gone by evening. The primary symptoms are a raging fever, extreme weakness, and often a widespread bleeding under the skin, which causes large patches of the body to turn dark purple or black. This is where the name Black Death might also have originated. It was so fast, so utterly overwhelming, that it seemed like a form of divine execution. You hear stories, whispered in fear, of people who went to bed well and were found lifeless in the morning, of merchants who closed up their shops in the evening and never returned to open them. A quirky but chilling detail from some contemporary accounts is the story of the lunching dead, where people were said to have had lunch with their friends, only to have supper with their ancestors in paradise. This was the septicemic plague. It offered no warning, no time to pray, no time to say goodbye. It was pure, concentrated terror, and it left survivors feeling as though they were living on borrowed time, that their own end could come at any moment without reason or warning. These three forms, the bubonic, the pneumonic, and the septicemic, were the enemy Europe now faced. A multi-pronged attack that could come from a flea bite, a cough, or seemingly from nowhere at all. It was a monster with many heads, and against it, the people of the 14th century were about to find that their traditional defenses were utterly, tragically useless. The pestilence is no longer an abstract threat. It is in your home, in your village. The bell in the parish church, which once told the comforting rhythm of the day, now seems to ring ceaselessly, marking the passing of another soul. In this moment of supreme crisis, all eyes turn to the healers. You seek out the most learned man you can find, the physician. You step into his study, a room that smells of dried herbs, parchment, and a faint, cloying sweetness meant to ward off foul odors. He is a man of status and education, able to read Latin and Greek, and his mind is filled with the accumulated medical knowledge of centuries, stretching back to Galen and Hippocrates. And it is all about to prove almost entirely useless. You look to him for answers, for a cure, and he meets your gaze with a combination of learned confidence and deep, furrowed brow concern. His entire understanding of disease is built upon a single powerful idea, the miasma theory. This is the bedrock of mainstream medieval medicine. The theory holds that disease is caused by miasma, which literally means pollution. It is a form of bad air, a noxious vapor that rises from rotting organic matter, from swamps, from corpses, from unhygienic places. This miasma, when inhaled, could disrupt the delicate balance of the four humors in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance of these humors was, in his view, the root cause of all illness. The plague, therefore, must be an especially potent and venomous miasma that has drifted across the land, perhaps unleashed by an earthquake or an unfortunate alignment of the planets. Armed with this theory, his prescribed treatments are entirely logical, yet tragically ineffective. His first priority is to combat the miasma. He advises you to stay indoors, to seal your windows and doors, and to burn aromatic woods like juniper or ash. He might sell you a small pomander, a metal ball filled with fragrant substances like ambergris, musk, or a complex blend of herbs, which you are to hold to your nose whenever you venture outside. The idea is to surround yourself with good air to fight off the bad. The wealthy burn incense and sweet-smelling herbs in their homes day and night, creating a perfumed fog that they hope will keep the poisonous air at bay. This is why you see those iconic plague doctor masks in later outbreaks, with their long beaks stuffed with herbs, a direct application of miasma theory. The physician's second line of attack is to rebalance your humors. If you are afflicted with a bubo, he will likely recommend lancing it. This is a painful, dangerous procedure. He takes a heated blade and slices into the swollen lymph node, hoping to release the venom or the corrupted matter that has collected there. After draining the bubo, he might apply a poultice. This is where things get creative. A quirky tidbit of medieval medicine is the sheer variety of bizarre ingredients used in these poultices. A common one was made from dried figs and onions mixed with yeast and butter. A more adventurous physician might recommend a plaster made from tree resin and the roots of white lilies. And the truly desperate might turn to recipes involving dried toads, or in a particularly strange application of sympathetic magic, placing a live, plucked chicken against the swelling until the chicken itself sickened and perished, supposedly drawing the illness out of the body. If lancing is not an option, the other primary method of rebalancing the humors is bloodletting. The physician, or more likely a barber surgeon he directs, will open a vein and drain a significant amount of your blood into a bowl. The logic is that the plague is a hot and wet disease caused by an excess of blood. By removing some of that blood, they hope to restore balance. They carefully consider which vein to open based on the location of your symptoms, following complex charts that map the veins of the body to various organs and astrological influences. For a patient already weakened by a massive bacterial infection, losing a pint or more of blood is, of course, the exact opposite of what the body needs. Historians still debate the role of these physicians. Were they charlatans who knowingly sold false hope, or were they sincere, educated men working within the absolute limits of their scientific understanding? The consensus leans heavily towards the latter. They were not fools. They were simply wrong. Their theories were internally consistent and based on centuries of revered medical texts. The problem was that the foundational premise, miasma, was incorrect. They were fighting the wrong enemy. They looked at the air, not at the flea. They focused on balancing internal humors, not on fighting an external bacterial invader. As the pestilence rages on, you can see the confidence draining from the physician's eyes. He sees his treatments failing over and over again. He sees his fellow doctors and priests perishing at an astonishing rate, as their duties bring them into close contact with the sick. Some physicians, terrified for their own lives, flee the cities along with the wealthy. Others, bound by their conscience and their Hippocratic oath, stay and continue to fight, armed with their useless, fragrant pomanders and their sharp lancets. They document what they see, writing down detailed descriptions of the symptoms noting the different forms of the disease and recording which treatments failed. These records, born of desperation and failure, would become invaluable for future generations. But in the moment, they are just a testament to utter helplessness. You look at this man of learning, this healer, and you realize that he is just as scared and powerless as you are. The established medical knowledge of your world has been presented with an enemy it cannot comprehend, and it has been found completely, tragically wanting. The physicians have failed you. Their sweet-smelling pomanders and grim bloodletting have done nothing to halt the tide. The sheer scale of the affliction is starting to break the very foundations of your understanding of the world. When medicine fails and reason falters, the human mind desperately seeks a cause, an explanation for such overwhelming and seemingly indiscriminate suffering. You huddle with your neighbors in the dwindling light of a tavern, or whisper in the nave of a church after yet another funeral. And you ask the question that hangs in the air like a shroud. Why? Why is this happening to us? The answers that emerge are a reflection of the deep anxieties, beliefs, and prejudices of your time. For the vast majority of people, the answer is terrifyingly simple. This is the wrath of God. It is a divine punishment for the sins of humanity. You look around at the world you knew just a few years ago, and you see sin everywhere. You see the pride of merchants, the greed of princes, the vanity of women with their fine clothes, the gluttony and drunkenness in the taverns. The church itself, with the Pope residing not in Rome, but in a palace of luxury in Avignon, France, seems to have lost its way. Surely, this pestilence is a new flood, a cleansing fire sent by a righteously angry God to scourge the world of its wickedness. This belief is the default, the mainstream historical consensus on how the average person interpreted the plague. It is a terrifying thought, but it is also, in a strange way, a comforting one. It preserves order in the universe. It means this isn't random. There is a reason, and if there is a reason, perhaps there is a solution. Penance. Prayer. A turning back to God. So, you pray. You pray with a fervor you have never known. The churches are more crowded than they have ever been, even as people know that crowding together might be dangerous. You join religious processions that wind through the streets, with people weeping and flagellating themselves, begging for God's mercy. You buy indulgences, make donations to the church, and light candles to the saints, especially to Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian, both of whom were traditionally invoked against plague. You are trying to appease an angry deity, to show him that you are sorry, that humanity is ready to repent. But as the days turn into weeks, and the pestilence only worsens, the prayers seem to go unanswered. The good die alongside the wicked. Pious priests are struck down in the middle of Mass. Innocent children perish in their beds. This horrifying lack of discrimination begins to shake the faith of many. If this is a divine punishment, it is a strangely imprecise one. The simple answer of God's wrath starts to feel insufficient, and the human mind, ever creative in its fear, begins to search for other explanations. Learned men at the University of Paris, commissioned by the King of France, turn their eyes to the heavens. After careful study, they produce a report, a document that becomes widely circulated. They conclude that the ultimate cause was a conjunction of 3 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, in the house of Aquarius, which occurred on March 20, 1345. This astrological event, they argue, drew up evil vapors from the earth and corrupted the air, creating the Great Pestilence. This explanation, blaming a distant and unstoppable celestial event, is a way of explaining the inexplicable without blaming either God or humanity. It's a quirky but deeply revealing tidbit of the medieval mindset, where science, magic, and religion were inextricably intertwined. Astrology was a serious intellectual pursuit, and for many, a planetary conjunction was a far more rational explanation than an invisible poison spread by rats. But for others, huddled in fear, the explanation must be more terrestrial, more immediate. The human mind often seeks a human agent, a villain, and so the darkest and most poisonous rumors begin to circulate. Whispers turn into accusations. Perhaps the wells have been poisoned. But by whom? Who would do such a thing? The finger of blame begins to point towards the outsiders, the vulnerable, the people who were already viewed with suspicion. Lepers, foreigners, pilgrims, and, most consistently and tragically, the Jewish communities scattered across Europe. While some officials, and Pope Clement VI himself, issued bulls declaring the Jewish people innocent and pointing out that they were dying from the plague at the same rate as Christians, their pleas for reason were often drowned out by the roar of the mob. So you are left with a terrifying menu of possible causes. Is it God, the planets, or your neighbors? Each explanation offers a different path. If it's God, you must pray. If it's the planets, you can only despair. And if it's poison, you must find and punish the poisoners. This fracturing of reality, this desperate search for a narrative to make sense of the chaos, is one of the most profound psychological impacts of the Great Mortality. Society is not just being assailed by a bacterium, it is being torn apart by its own fear. The prayers feel hollow, and the planetary explanations offer no comfort. For a significant portion of the population, the belief in God's wrath remains absolute, but the prescribed solutions, quiet prayer, attending Mass, lighting candles, feel wholly inadequate for the scale of the sin and the fury of the punishment. A more extreme penance is needed, a more dramatic display of contrition to turn aside the divine anger. It is from this sentiment of spiritual desperation that one of the most bizarre and unsettling spectacles of the Black Death era emerges. You are about to witness the march of the Flagellants. You hear them before you see them. First, a faint, rhythmic chanting and carried on the wind, growing steadily louder. Then, the slow, mournful tolling of a single bell. A procession appears on the road leading to your town, and the entire populace pours out of their homes, lining the streets in a mixture of awe, pity, and morbid curiosity. This is not a king's procession, nor a band of traveling merchants. These are the brothers of the cross, the Flagellants. They march in a long double file, their heads bowed, faces often covered by hoods. They are barefoot, and their upper bodies are bare to the waist, revealing backs that are already a crisscrossed mess of welts and dried blood. In their hands, they carry the instrument of their devotion, a terrifying scourge, a whip with multiple leather thongs, each tipped with a sharp piece of metal or bone. They are an organized, almost military movement. They march from town to town, following a strict ritual. Upon arriving in a new settlement, they proceed to the public square or the churchyard. There, they form a large circle, and the ritual begins. A leader, often called the master, will read a letter, which they claim was delivered by an angel, explaining the necessity of their pilgrimage and penance. Then, as the chanting rises to a fever pitch, they fall to their knees. At a signal, the scourges rise and fall in a grim, synchronized rhythm. They whip themselves on their backs and chests, the metal tips tearing at their flesh. They prostrate themselves on the ground in the shape of a cross, while others step over them, continuing the lashing. This is not a private act of devotion. It is a public performance of extreme piety, meant to be witnessed by you and your neighbors. The flagellants believe they are taking the sins of the world onto their own shoulders, literally. By performing this ritual, they hope to serve as a lightning rod for God's anger, to offer their own suffering as a substitute for the destruction of the community. For many onlookers, it is a powerful and convincing sight. In a time of utter helplessness, here are people taking action, doing something, no matter how extreme. Some of your neighbors fall to their knees, weeping. Others are so moved by the spectacle that they join the procession, leaving their homes and families behind to take up the scourge themselves. The Flagellant movement of 1348 to 1349 was not entirely new. There had been smaller flagellant movements before, during other times of crisis. But the Black Death supercharged the phenomenon, turning it into a mass European craze. A quirky and often overlooked aspect of the movement was its highly structured nature. This was not just a disorganized mob. Each member took an oath to remain with the Brotherhood for 33 and a half days, a number symbolizing the years of Christ's earthly life. They were forbidden from speaking to women, from bathing, or from changing their clothes. A master enforced discipline, and the movement had its own hymns and rituals. It was, in effect, a new, mobile, and radical religious order, operating entirely outside the control of the established church. And that is precisely why the authorities, both secular and religious, quickly grew to despise them. At first, the flagellants were often welcomed, their piety seen as an asset. But the welcome soon wore thin. The movement's leaders began to preach directly to the people, claiming they could absolve sins, a power reserved exclusively for the priesthood. They interrupted church services, challenged the authority of local priests, and their radical, apocalyptic fervor often stirred up social unrest. The established church, already struggling to maintain its authority in the face of the plague, saw the flagellants as a direct and dangerous threat. Pope Clement VI, the same man who had argued for the innocence of the Jews, was one of their most powerful opponents. Historians still debate the true nature of the flagellant movement. Was it a genuine, if misguided, grassroots spiritual revival? Or was it a form of mass psychological contagion, a shared delusion fueled by the unimaginable trauma of the plague? It was likely a complex mix of both. The ritual itself, the rhythmic chanting, and the self-inflicted pain would have induced a trance-like, ecstatic state in the participants, reinforcing their belief and their fervor. They were caught in a feedback loop of pain, piety, and public performance. Furthermore, as the movement grew more radical and less controlled, it absorbed the darkest prejudices of the age. As the flagellants marched through the towns of the Rhineland and Flanders, their apocalyptic fervor often boiled over into violence. They became amplifiers of the conspiracy theories you've already heard, actively preaching that the plague was caused by the poisoning of wells. In many towns, the arrival of the flagellants was the direct precursor to a violent pogrom against the local Jewish community. The very people who sought to save the world through an act of supreme sacrifice became the perpetrators of horrific violence against their neighbors. Ultimately, the movement burned itself out. The combination of papal condemnation, the opposition of secular rulers who feared their power, and the simple fact that the plague did not abate no matter how much they whipped themselves, caused the movement to collapse. By 1350, they were officially condemned as heretics, and the remaining groups were suppressed. But for a year or two, they were a vivid, bloody, and unforgettable feature of the plague-stricken landscape. As you watch the last of the procession disappear down the road, leaving behind a few spatters of blood on the cobblestones, you are left to wonder, was that an act of supreme faith or of collective madness? In the world of the Great Pestilence, the line between the two had become almost impossible to see. While the Flagellants march through the muddy roads, and the poor huddle in their parishes praying for deliverance, another story is unfolding. It's a quieter story, one of privilege and retreat. Not everyone is staying put to face the music. If you have money, if you have land, if you have options, a different course of action presents itself. You decide to flee. The miasma, the bad air, is thickest in the cities. The pestilence seems to spread fastest where people are pressed together. The logical solution, then, is to go where the air is clean and the people are few. The countryside. You are now part of a frantic yet orderly exodus of the wealthy. You pack your most valuable possessions into sturdy chests. Not everything, just what can be carried on a few wagons. Silver plates, fine clothes, a few cherished books, and enough gold to ensure your comfort. You leave your grand townhouse in Florence or Paris in the care of a few unfortunate servants who have no choice but to stay. The mood is not one of panic, but of grim necessity. This is a strategic retreat, a temporary relocation until the unpleasantness in the city passes. You tell yourself it will only be for a few months. The journey itself is a strange bubble of normalcy in a world gone mad. You travel in a small, self-sufficient party. Your family, a few loyal retainers, a cook, and perhaps a man-at-arms for protection. The roads are more dangerous than usual, with desperate people and a general breakdown of order. But your wealth insulates you. You avoid the towns and villages where the plague is known to be raging, making wide detours and camping in open fields if necessary. You are running away, but you are doing it in style. Your destination is your country villa, a beautiful estate nestled in the rolling hills of Tuscany or the green fields of the Ile-de-France. When you arrive, it feels like entering another world. Here, the air is sweet with the scent of pine and ripening grapes. The sky is a vast, open blue, not the cramped sliver you're used to seeing between leaning buildings. The only sounds are the buzzing of bees and the rustle of leaves in the wind. The contrast with the city you left behind, the constant tolling of bells, the stench of sickness, the palpable fear, is so profound it makes you feel dizzy. Here, the plague seems a distant rumor, a problem for other people. This escape is perfectly immortalized in one of the great literary works of the period, Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron. This is a mainstream historical artifact that gives us a priceless window into this elite experience. Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, frames his collection of stories with this very scenario. He describes a group of 7 young women and 3 young men, all from wealthy Florentine families, who retreat to a secluded villa outside the city to wait out the Black Death. Their life there is an idyll of pleasant living. They spend their days in beautiful gardens, listening to music, playing games, and, most famously, telling stories to pass the time. Each person tells one story a day for 10 days, resulting in the 100 tales that make up the book. Their life, as Boccaccio describes it, is a deliberate construction of paradise against a backdrop of hell. They establish a set of rules for their little community, electing a king or queen for the day to preside over their activities. They feast on fine foods, drink good wine, and engage in witty conversation. It is an attempt to maintain civilization, grace, and order while the world outside descends into chaos. A quirky tidbit from the book is the sheer detail Boccaccio provides about their pleasant routines, the morning walks, the afternoon naps in the shade, the evening dances. It's a powerful statement. While the city is consumed by a breakdown of all social norms, they are reinforcing them. However, historians debate how accurately the Decameron reflects the reality for most of the fleeing nobility and wealthy merchants. Was it truly such a pleasant, carefree holiday from the plague? Or is Boccaccio's work an idealized fantasy, a literary construct designed to contrast the beauty of art and human resilience with the ugliness of the pestilence? The reality for many was likely more complicated. While their material comfort was assured, the psychological burden of the plague could not be entirely escaped. News would still trickle in from the cities, carried by messengers who were carefully kept at a distance. You would hear of friends, business partners, and family members who had stayed behind and succumbed. The fear was a constant low hum beneath the surface of the pleasantries. Moreover, the countryside was not a guaranteed sanctuary. This is a crucial point often missed in the romanticized image of the flight to the villa. The plague was slower to reach the rural areas, but it did reach them. A traveling friar seeking shelter, a servant sneaking back from a visit to his family in a nearby village, or the same rats that infested the cities stowing away in a grain shipment. The vectors of transmission were everywhere. The idyllic isolation could be shattered in an instant by the first telltale fever. Suddenly, the beautiful villa becomes a gilded cage, your private paradise transformed into a private graveyard. The story of the wealthy fleeing the city is a story of stark inequality. It highlights a fundamental truth of this and many other crises. The ability to socially distance, to isolate oneself from risk, has always been a privilege of wealth. The poor of the cities had no such option. Their world was the cramped apartment, the crowded street, the public well. They could not run. Your ability to retreat to your villa is a direct function of your station in life. As you sit in your sun-drenched garden, sipping wine and listening to a lute, you feel a strange mixture of relief and guilt. You have escaped. You have used your resources to build a wall between yourself and the horror. But you know the wall is fragile, and you know that the world you left behind, the world that is being systematically unmade by the pestilence, is the source of all your wealth and comfort. You may have escaped the plague for now, but you cannot escape its consequences. Your peaceful, privileged isolation in the countryside feels like a different reality. But the world outside your villa walls continues to fracture. Back in the cities and towns, the relentless pressure of the pestilence is doing more than just afflicting bodies. It's corroding the very soul of society. The search for a cause, which we explored earlier, now moves into its darkest and most violent phase. Fear needs an object. Panic demands a sacrifice. You are about to witness how communities, driven to the edge of sanity, turned inward and began to hunt for scapegoats. The atmosphere in a plague-stricken town is thick with paranoia. Every sudden ailment, every unexplained event, is viewed through a lens of suspicion. The social trust that holds a community together has evaporated. Your neighbor is no longer just your neighbor. He is a potential carrier. The stranger passing through town is no longer a traveler. He is a potential poisoner. This breakdown of trust creates a fertile ground for the deadliest conspiracy theories to flourish. And as we've seen, the most widespread and vicious of these was the belief that the wells had been deliberately poisoned by the Jewish population. You are in a town in the Rhine Valley, in the Holy Roman Empire, a region where these accusations reached a fever pitch. A local man falls gravely ill. His family, mad with grief and fear, needs someone to blame. They remember seeing a Jewish neighbor near the town well a few days prior. The memory, innocuous at the time, is now twisted into something sinister. A rumor starts. A whisper becomes a shout. A shout becomes a mob. The local authorities, the town council, the local bishop, are often powerless or, in some cases, complicit. They may try to intervene, but the popular fury, fanned by decades of religious anti-Judaism, is like a wildfire. The mob descends on the Jewish quarter of the town. These quarters were often distinct, sometimes walled, a result of both communal choice and enforced segregation. Now, this separation makes them an easy target. The crowd, armed with farming tools and blind rage, breaks down the gates. What follows is a scene of unspeakable horror, a tragic and recurring chapter of the Black Death. People who had been neighbors for generations are now hunted in the streets. Homes are looted and burned. Families are dragged from their cellars and given a horrific choice: baptism or the sword. A mainstream historical fact is the sheer scale and organized nature of these massacres. In city after city, Strasbourg, Basel, Mainz, Erfurt, entire Jewish communities were systematically annihilated. The massacre at Strasbourg in February 1349 is one of the most chilling examples. Even before the plague had reached the city, the local guilds, fearing its arrival and already in debt to Jewish moneylenders, drove a political coup. They overthrew the city council that had protected the Jewish community and, on St. Valentine's Day, rounded up the city's entire Jewish population, some 2,000 people. They were taken to the Jewish cemetery and perished in the flames on a massive wooden platform. This wasn't just random mob violence. It was a premeditated, organized tragedy. And what happened after is just as telling. The council passed laws forbidding any Jew from settling in Strasbourg for 100 years. Their property was confiscated, and the outstanding debts owed to them by Christian citizens were canceled. It reveals the toxic blend of religious hysteria and cold, economic calculation that drove these events. Now, a quirky and heartbreaking tidbit from this period is the phenomenon of Jewish martyrdom. In many communities, seeing the mob approach, residents chose to end their own lives rather than fall into the hands of their persecutors. Chroniclers record stories of parents taking the lives of their own children and then themselves, seeing it as a final act of devotion to their faith, a somber echo of the martyrdom stories from their scriptures. This was a conscious choice to sanctify God's name, Kiddush Hashem, in the face of forced conversion or a brutal end. It is a testament to the profound spiritual crisis and the impossible choices people faced. As we've touched upon, historians still debate the primary driver of these pogroms. Was it the spontaneous rage of the common people? A genuine but diluted belief that they were eliminating the source of the plague? This is the popular fury argument. Or was it, as the Strasbourg example suggests, a more cynical plot by the upper classes and civic leaders who used the plague as an excuse to eliminate their creditors and seize wealth? This is the elite manipulation argument. The truth is likely a messy combination of both. The elites may have fanned the flames, but the fire of popular prejudice was already there, waiting for a spark. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, issued a papal bull in 1348 that flatly condemned the violence. He argued, with impeccable logic, that the plague was also devastating Jewish communities and was raging in lands where no Jews lived. He threatened the perpetrators with excommunication. But in the hysteria of the moment, even the Pope's authority was not enough to stop the massacres in many parts of Germany and France. The scapegoating was not limited to Jewish communities, though they were by far the most frequent and devastated victims. In Spain, Arabs were sometimes blamed. Elsewhere, people accused as witches or sorcerers were targeted. Foreigners of any kind, recognizable by their different dress or accent, were treated with extreme suspicion. Even the poor and marginalized within a community, hermits, recluses, people with physical deformities, could suddenly find themselves accused of spreading the disease through malice or witchcraft. This wave of violence that swept across Europe alongside the plague reveals a terrifying aspect of human nature in crisis. When faced with a threat that is invisible, incomprehensible, and seemingly unstoppable, the impulse to find a human face for that threat can become overwhelming. It's a way of reclaiming a sense of agency, of control. You can't fight a miasma or a planetary conjunction, but you can attack a person. The hunt for scapegoats was a symptom of a society that had lost its mind, a desperate and tragic attempt to impose order on chaos by creating new victims. It did nothing to stop the plague, but it added a thick layer of man-made horror on top of a natural catastrophe. Your isolated country villa may have offered a temporary reprieve, but you cannot hide forever. The plague, an implacable traveler, does not respect the neat divisions between city and countryside. Having saturated the urban centers and followed the panicked trails of those who fled, it now begins to seep into the very fabric of the rural world. And here, in the vast, seemingly tranquil expanses of farmland and forest, it brings a different kind of terror and triggers the slow-motion collapse of an entire way of life. You are now looking upon the feudal system, the great pyramid structure that has organized European society for centuries. At the top is the king. Below him, the great lords and barons, then the knights and lesser nobles, and forming the vast base of the pyramid are the serfs and peasants who do all the work. It is a system built on land and obligation. The lord owns the land, and the peasants work it. In return for a plot to farm for themselves and the protection of the lord, the peasants owe him a certain number of days of labor on his own fields, a portion of their harvest, and various other dues and taxes. It is a rigid, hereditary system. You are born a peasant. You work the same land your father worked, and you will pass it on to your son. It is a life of relentless, back-breaking toil, dictated by the rhythm of the seasons. When the pestilence arrives in your small, isolated village, it is a bewildering event. There is no crowded port, no bustling market to blame. Perhaps it arrived with a traveling peddler, a priest making his rounds, or even a nobleman returning to his country manor from the city. However it gets there, its effect is devastating. In a small, close-knit community where families have intermarried for generations, the pneumonic form of the plague can be especially cruel, passing through households with terrifying speed. The most immediate effect is the sudden, unnerving silence. You walk through the village at what should be the height of the harvest season, and the fields are empty. The scythes lie where they were dropped. The wheat stands tall and golden, ready to be cut, but there is no one left with the strength to cut it. Farm animals, untended, wander aimlessly, their calls echoing in the quiet air. In some villages, the affliction is so absolute that literally no one survives. Chroniclers from the time write of entire hamlets being wiped off the map, discovered months later by a traveling official, the houses filled with the long departed, the fields overgrown with weeds. It's a chilling image. Nature reclaiming the land not over centuries, but in a single season. This is a mainstream historical fact. The sheer drop in agricultural production was catastrophic. With the workforce depleted, not enough food could be harvested to feed the survivors. This led to localized famines in the years immediately following the first wave of the plague, a secondary crisis piling on top of the first. The lord of the manor, looking out from his stone house, is in a state of panic. His wealth is not in gold coins stored in a chest. His wealth is the grain from his fields, the wool from his sheep. And that wealth is currently rotting on the stalk because the workforce that he had always taken for granted has simply vanished. Historians debate the precise mortality rate in the countryside versus the cities. For a long time, it was assumed that the lower population density of rural areas meant they suffered less. However, more recent research, including archaeological digs of village sites, suggests that in many rural areas the death toll was just as high, if not higher, than in the cities. A city might have a constant influx of new people from the surrounding areas, while a small village had no one to replace its losses. When a village's population fell below a certain threshold, it simply ceased to be viable. Amidst this devastation, a quirky and telling detail emerges from the legal records of the time: the problem of runaway animals. With so many farmers gone, their livestock, pigs, cows, sheep, were left to fend for themselves. These animals broke through fences, trampled crops, and roamed the countryside in feral herds. Manor court rolls are filled with cases and fines related to wandering livestock, a mundane legal problem that points to the complete breakdown of the normal agricultural order. It's a strange, almost comical image of pigs causing chaos in a lord's private garden, but it's a symptom of a world turned upside down. For the peasants who survive, a strange and unprecedented situation begins to dawn on them. You have lived your entire life in a world where land is scarce and labor is cheap. The Lord held all the power because there were always 10 other peasants ready to take your place if you complained. But now, everything has been inverted. Suddenly, land is plentiful. You can see half a dozen empty plots from your own doorway, their former tenants gone, and labor, your labor, is incredibly scarce and therefore valuable. The lord of the manor comes to you, his tone not one of command, but of negotiation. He needs you to work his fields. He needs you to bring in his harvest. And you, for the first time in the history of your family, have leverage. You can make demands. You can ask for higher wages for your labor. You can demand that your traditional feudal obligations be commuted to a simple cash rent. You might even threaten to leave, to walk down the road to the next manor where the Lord is offering even better terms. This is a revolutionary shift in thinking. The bonds of serfdom, which had tied your family to this specific piece of land for centuries, are beginning to dissolve. You are no longer just a serf, an extension of the land itself. You are becoming a worker, a free agent who can sell his labor to the highest bidder. The silence of the fields, a sound of horror and loss, is also, paradoxically, the sound of an old world dying and a new one struggling to be born. The first, and by far the most violent, wave of the pestilence has finally passed. It burned through Europe from 1347 to 1351, and now an exhausted, traumatized continent takes its first shaky breath. The immediate crisis is over, but the world you knew is gone forever. Now, you must walk through the ghost of that world, a landscape defined not by what is there, but by what is missing. The silence of the fields you witnessed was just the beginning. Now, a profound and eerie quiet has settled over everything. This is a world remade by absence. You return to the city you fled, perhaps from your country villa, or from a neighboring village where you took refuge. The first thing you notice is the space. The streets, which were once a chaotic, jostling torrent of humanity, now feel wide and empty. You can walk down the main thoroughfare without brushing shoulders with a single person. The background din of life, the shouting merchants, the hammering artisans, the rumbling carts, has been replaced by a quiet so deep you can hear the wind whistling around the corners of the buildings. It is a city in shock. populated by ghosts and memories. You walk past houses with doors sealed shut, the mark of the plague still visible. Some are simply abandoned, their owners having fled or perished entirely. Weeds are already beginning to sprout between the cobblestones in the quieter alleyways. The sheer demographic collapse is staggering. The mainstream historical consensus is that the Black Death carried off somewhere between 30% and 50% of Europe's entire population in those few short years. In some regions, like Tuscany or Normandy, the toll may have been as high as 60% or even 70%. Think about that for a moment. Imagine half the people you have ever known being gone. Your family, your friends, your rivals, the baker you bought bread from every morning, the priest who heard your confession. It's a level of loss that is almost impossible for the modern mind to comprehend. Society has been hollowed out from the inside. This depopulation creates a series of strange, surreal situations. You see inheritances passing sideways to distant cousins or nephews 3 times removed, as entire family lines are extinguished. Wills written in haste on the eve of the plague are now the subject of complex legal battles between unlikely heirs. A quirky but common sight in the years after 1351 is the new rich, people of humble origins who, through a combination of luck and the elimination of everyone above them in the social hierarchy, suddenly find themselves in possession of a house, a business, or a plot of land they could never have dreamed of owning. A weaver's apprentice might inherit his master's entire workshop. A landless peasant might find himself the sole heir to his uncle's prosperous farm. But for every story of unexpected fortune, there are 1,000 stories of loss. The psychological toll on the survivors is immense. There is a pervasive sense of what historians call survivor's guilt. Why me? Why did I live when my wife, my children, my parents were taken? This question haunts the waking hours and fills the dreams of those left behind. Many turn to piety, believing they were spared for a divine purpose. Others fall into a deep melancholy, a state of listlessness and despair that physicians of the time called acedia. And still others, believing that life is short and unpredictable, plunge into a frenetic hedonism, determined to enjoy what little time they might have left. The taverns, though fewer people frequent them, are scenes of wild drinking and gambling. The very landscape of belief is altered. The church, which had offered prayers and processions as a defense against the plague, had been shown to be powerless. The institution itself survived, but its authority was subtly undermined. People's faith became more personal, more direct. They had seen priests die just as readily as sinners, and this led to a questioning of the clergy's role as special intercessors with God. Historians still debate the long-term impact of this crisis of faith. Some argue that the Black Death was a major catalyst for the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later, by shaking people's confidence in the traditional Catholic Church structure and fostering a desire for a more individual relationship with God. The world is also full of orphan children and widowed spouses. The social fabric, woven from the threads of family and kinship, is in tatters. Communities have to find new ways to care for the vulnerable. Communities have to find new ways to care for the vulnerable. Guilds, which were professional associations, often stepped in to support the widows and children of their deceased members. New charitable organizations and orphanages were founded. There's a grim necessity to this rebuilding. Society cannot function without its basic structures, and the survivors, numb as they are, must find a way to patch the holes and carry on. You walk through a marketplace and see stalls that are closed and shuttered, not for the day, but for good. The variety of goods available has shrunk. The specialized craftsman who made the best leather saddles in town is gone, and no one remembers his technique. There is a loss of skill, a loss of knowledge that will take generations to recover. This is the world after the great mortality. Quieter, emptier, sadder. It is a world full of empty chairs at the dinner table, empty plots of land in the fields, and empty spaces in the hearts of the survivors. But in this vast emptiness, in this profound absence, the seeds of a new world are unintentionally being planted. A world where the old certainties are gone, and everything, from the value of a man's labor to the nature of his faith, is suddenly, unexpectedly, up for negotiation. The eerie quiet of the depopulated world is slowly being replaced by a new sound, the sound of argument. You stand in the center of this radically emptier world and witness a fundamental law of economics asserting itself with brutal clarity. When supply is low and demand is high, the price goes up. For centuries, the supply was an ocean of peasants, and land was the scarce commodity. Now, in the wake of the plague, the equation has been flipped on its head. Land is everywhere, and people are the rare commodity. This is not a subtle academic point. It is a reality that is reshaping society from the ground up, starting with you, the common worker. If you are one of the peasant survivors we met earlier, your newfound leverage is intoxicating. The lord of the manor needs his fields plowed and his harvest brought in. But half of his former workforce is gone. He cannot force you to work for the old wages or under the old terms. You and your fellow survivors are in a position to bargain. You refuse to perform the traditional unpaid labor service, the corvée. Instead, you demand a wage, in cash. And not just any wage, but a high one. You know that if your lord refuses, the lord in the next valley over, who is just as desperate for workers, will likely meet your price. For the first time, a competitive labor market has emerged from the ashes of the feudal system. This dynamic is not limited to the countryside. In the cities, the situation is even more acute. You are a craftsman, a stonemason, a weaver, a carpenter. The guilds, which used to be powerful cartels that controlled who could work and for what price, have been gutted. The old masters are gone, and their apprentices with them. If a wealthy merchant wants to build a new house, he finds that there are only a handful of masons left in the city. And you, as one of those masons, can name your price. Wages for skilled laborers in the decades after the Black Death skyrocketed, in some places doubling or even tripling. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by countless account books and wage records from the period. The sudden, drastic labor shortage led to a massive redistribution of wealth from the land-owning and merchant classes to the laboring classes. A peasant who survived the plague could find his real income increase dramatically in the years that followed. They had more disposable income than ever before, which they spent on better food, better clothing, and perhaps even luxuries that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. A quirky detail that illustrates this is the rise of what were called sumptuary laws. These were laws passed by the nobility and upper classes that attempted to regulate what people of different social stations were allowed to wear. They were a direct reaction to seeing peasants and artisans suddenly dressing in finer clothes and fabrics that were once reserved for the elite. The nobles were offended that they could no longer immediately tell a commoner from a nobleman just by looking at their clothes. These laws were, in essence, an attempt to put the genie of social mobility back in the bottle. Of course, the ruling classes did not take this shift in power lying down. They fought back. In England, in 1351, King Edward III issued the Statute of Laborers. This law attempted to fix wages at their pre-plague levels. It made it a crime for a peasant to demand higher wages, and a crime for an employer to offer them. It forbade workers from leaving their current master in search of a better offer. Similar laws were passed in France, Castile, and other kingdoms. The elites were trying to use the power of the state to artificially suppress the market forces that were benefiting the common people. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these laws. On the one hand, they were very difficult to enforce. In a world where labor was so desperately needed, employers had a strong incentive to break the law and pay higher wages under the table just to get the workers they needed. On the other hand, the laws created enormous resentment and friction. They were a clear sign that the nobility was trying to roll back the clock and return to the old ways, denying the new reality. This clash between the aspirations of the newly empowered working class and the reactionary policies of the ruling class would lead to decades of social unrest. The famous Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, as well as the Jacquerie in France a few decades earlier, were direct consequences of this tension. The peasants and workers had gotten a taste of freedom and economic power, and they were not willing to give it up without a fight. So, you are living in a time of incredible economic paradox. The world has been shattered by a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Yet for the survivors at the bottom of the social ladder, life is, in some material ways, better than it has ever been. The old hierarchies are weakening, and man is no longer defined solely by the station of his birth, but increasingly by his skills and the value of his labor. This is the dawn of the worker as a powerful economic and political force. The Black Death, by clearing the board and rewriting the rules of supply and demand, inadvertently set in motion a series of changes that would ultimately dismantle the rigid feudal structure of the Middle Ages and lay the economic groundwork for the modern world. The road from serf to citizen started here, in the empty fields and half-staffed workshops of a post-plague Europe. The world has been profoundly altered, not just in its social and economic structures, but in its very soul. The experience of living through such a colossal, arbitrary thinning of humanity has left a deep psychological scar on the survivors. This trauma, this new and intimate relationship with mortality, inevitably begins to express itself in the culture of the age. You see it in the churches, you hear it in the sermons, and most vividly, you see it in the art. The way people picture the world and their place in it has changed forever. Before the plague, medieval art was largely serene and confident. It depicted a stable, divinely ordered universe. Christ was often portrayed as a majestic, triumphant king. The Virgin Mary was a gentle, merciful Queen of Heaven. The stories of the saints were rendered in bright colors and gold leaf, celebrating their virtue and their heavenly reward. There was suffering, of course, but it was almost always part of a clear narrative of sacrifice and salvation. The art reflected a world that made sense. But after the pestilence, a new, darker, and more macabre sensibility begins to creep in. You enter a parish church, and on one of the walls, you see a new and unsettling kind of painting. It's a mural depicting a procession, but it's not the procession of the Flagellants or of a king. It's a procession of the living and the dead, linked together in a grim parade. This is the danse macabre, or the dance of death, a new artistic genre that became incredibly popular in the wake of the plague. This is a mainstream historical fact of post-plague art. In these murals, skeletons or decaying corpses are shown dancing with people from every walk of life. A skeleton leads a pope by the hand, another grabs a king, another an armored knight, a wealthy merchant, a beautiful maiden, and a humble peasant. The message of the Danse Macabre is brutally simple and democratic. Death comes for everyone. It doesn't matter if you are rich or poor, powerful or humble, pious or sinful. Your wealth cannot buy you off. Your power cannot protect you. Your piety cannot save you. In the face of death, all are equal. This was a truth that the plague had demonstrated with terrifying clarity. The art is not just a morbid fascination, it's a powerful social commentary. For the common person looking at this mural, there was a certain grim satisfaction in seeing the Pope and the Emperor being dragged away by a grinning skeleton, just like everyone else. It was an artistic affirmation of the new, unsettling equality that the plague had introduced to the world. This new focus on the decay of the body also manifested in tomb sculptures. A quirky and rather gruesome artistic trend that emerged was the transy tomb, or cadaver tomb. Before the plague, a nobleman's tomb would typically feature a serene, idealized effigy of himself, dressed in his finest armor or robes, looking noble and peaceful in death. The new transy tombs offered a shocking contrast. The upper part of the tomb might still have that traditional idealized effigy, but below it, on a lower level, would be a second sculpture, a stomach-churning, hyper-realistic depiction of the same person's decaying corpse, emaciated, skin stretched taut over bone, and often shown writhing with worms and other creatures of putrefaction. The purpose was to serve as a powerful memento mori, a reminder of death. It told the viewer, "As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be." It was a stark rejection of earthly vanity and a brutal reminder of the fragility of the flesh. Historians still debate the precise emotional tone of this new art. Was it born purely of terror and pessimism, a reflection of a traumatized society obsessed with its own decay? Or was there also a note of piety, a call to turn away from the vanities of this world and focus on the salvation of your soul, which was the only thing you could take with you? The answer is likely both. The art is simultaneously terrifying and didactic. It shocks the viewer with the physical horror of death in order to deliver a spiritual message about the importance of living a good life. This new uncertainty also bleeds into religious life. The confident, institutional faith of the pre-plague era gives way to a more personal, emotional, and often anxious form of devotion. There is a new emphasis on the suffering of Christ. Art begins to depict the crucifixion with a new graphic intensity, focusing on the pain and the wounds. The echoes of the dancing skeletons on the church wall fade, but the rhythm of that dance lingers. You have walked through a world undone and remade. You have seen the arrival of the pestilence, felt the helplessness of the healers, witnessed the desperate search for answers in prayer, penance, and persecution. You have followed the rich to their secluded villas and felt the ground shift under the feet of the peasants in the silent fields. You have seen how a microscopic organism could fell an entire social order and repaint the art and soul of a continent. Now, as the 14th century recedes, we pull back and consider the long, lingering shadow that this catastrophe cast across the centuries to come. The Black Death was not a one-time event. That first terrible wave from 1347 to 1351 was the most devastating, but it was not the end. The plague returned, again and again, for the next 300 years. It became a recurring character in the drama of European life. There were major outbreaks in the 1360s, the so-called pestis puerorum, or plague of the children, as it seemed to disproportionately affect the new generation born after the first wave. And then again in the 1370s, and on, every 10 or 20 years, a new flare-up would remind everyone of the fragility of their world. This is a crucial mainstream fact. The plague didn't just hit Europe once. It became an endemic disease, a constant background threat that kept the population from recovering to its pre-1346 levels for more than 2 centuries. This had profound, long-term consequences. The labor shortages you witnessed became a permanent feature of the economy, not a temporary shock. This accelerated all the trends we saw beginning: the decline of serfdom, the rise of wages, and the increasing power of the common person. The nobility's attempts to force society back into its old feudal box with laws like the Statute of Laborers were ultimately doomed to fail. The economic realities were simply too powerful. This long-term pressure helped to create a more dynamic and mobile society, one where a person's worth was increasingly tied to their skill and capital, not just their birth. In a very real sense, the Black Death cleared the way for the emergence of a recognizable form of capitalism. The intellectual and scientific world was also transformed. The utter failure of scholastic, university-trained physicians to explain or treat the plague led to a crisis of confidence in traditional, text-based medicine. It fostered a new spirit of empiricism, a desire to learn from direct observation, rather than just relying on the ancient texts of Galen and Aristotle. A quirky but important detail is the increase in human dissections at medical universities in the wake of the plague. Previously, a rare and controversial practice, the need to understand this new disease and the sheer availability of bodies led physicians to start looking inside the human body for answers. This new willingness to observe, to question authority, and to seek knowledge from experience rather than just from books is one of the foundational pillars of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Historians still debate the full extent of the plague's role in kickstarting these massive cultural shifts. Was the Black Death the primary cause of the Renaissance, or did it merely accelerate changes that were already underway? It's a classic chicken and egg problem. Some argue that the shock of the plague, the focus on human suffering and resilience, and the new wealth concentrated in the hands of survivors directly fueled the explosion of art and humanism in 15th century Italy. Others argue that the Renaissance was a more complex phenomenon, with roots stretching back long before the plague's arrival. The most balanced view is that the plague acted as a massive, violent catalyst. It didn't create the Renaissance out of nothing, but it shattered the old world so completely that it created the space for the new world to be born. The pestilence taught Europe a series of hard lessons that would echo for centuries. It led to the invention of public health as a concept. Italian city-states like Venice and Ragusa developed the first organized public health responses, the creation of quarantine protocols. Remember our 40 days. The establishment of permanent plague hospitals called lazarettos, and the creation of boards of health with the power to enforce sanitation rules. These were the very first steps towards the modern systems of public health and disease control that we rely on today. The ghost of Yersinia pestis haunts the corridors of the CDC and the World Health Organization. As you stand now, at the end of our journey, you can see the vast, tangled web of consequences stretching out from those fateful years. A biological event in the steppes of Asia led to the empowerment of a peasant in England. A desperate act of warfare at Caffa led to the masterpieces of Renaissance art. The failure of medieval medicine helped to give birth to modern science. The Black Death was a calamity without parallel, a period of unimaginable suffering and loss. But it was also, paradoxically, a creative force. It was a forest fire that burned the old growth down to the soil, leaving behind a fertile ground from which new ideas, new social structures, and a new understanding of the world could spring. It stands as a terrifying and humbling reminder that history is not just shaped by the grand deeds of kings and generals, but also by the silent, invisible work of microbes, and that the path to the modern world was paved in no small part by the dead. And so, our long journey through the shadow of the great pestilence comes to a gentle close. The echoes of the tolling bells begin to fade, replaced by the soft, steady sound of your own quiet breathing. The unsettling images of a world in turmoil recede, leaving behind only the calm and stillness of your present moment. The immense and overwhelming tide of history, with all its sorrow and all its change, softens into a distant murmur, like waves receding from a shore. Let the knowledge of the resilience of those who survived, of the slow and steady rebuilding of a shattered world, be a quiet comfort. They endured, they adapted, and they laid the foundations for the world that came after. Now, there is nothing left to analyze, nothing more to see. There is only the darkness, the comfort of your bed, and the gentle pull of sleep. Let your mind drift. Let the last vestiges of the story dissolve into the formless, peaceful landscape of your dreams. The past is quiet now. All is well.